Hello everybody, good evening. Welcome to the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre for our Tuesday Talk programme. My name's Chloe Dees and I run the Psychic Investigation Unit at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. And tonight it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Cal Cooper. So for those of you who don't know, Dr. Cal Cooper is well known to us here at the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. Dr. Cooper is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Northampton, and he delivers classes and conducts research on subjects including death and bereavement, positive psychology, human sexual behaviour, parapsychology and research methods. So he's a busy boy. Dr. Cooper should really be called Dr. Cooper, since he's got two doctorates, one from the University of, now let me get this right, Manchester Metropolitan University, and the other one from University of Northampton, but he also has his master's from Sheffield Hallam University. Cal is a chartered psychologist with the British Psychological Society. He is a fellow of the Higher Educational Society. He's a member of the Society for the Society for Psychical Research. He sits on its council and on the Survival Research Committee. And I could go on for the rest of the evening telling you the many, many things that Cal is involved in and the numerous awards and grants that he has also done. And in his spare time, he also writes books, including some wonderfully rare books, which I happen to have. So one of Cal's rare books, oh, it doesn't flip the screen, this is Telephone Calls from the Dead, which I'm told is very rare. But Cal also has written some fantastically interesting books. He has co-authored Psi and Psychotherapy, Conversations with Ghosts, Paracoustics is another one of Cal's books. So he has been incredibly busy. And it's my pleasure to introduce him. Tonight's talk is on the Psi Wars. So you came here to hear Dr. Cooper. Without further ado, I shall hand you over.
Thank you very much, Chloe. That's a very lovely introduction. And as you could see, I was pouring something. It was a can of ghost dance. So I'm well set up. So this is a bit of a different talk for me. Lately, I have mainly been giving talks on things such as after-death communication, people having sense of presence phenomena, dreaming of the dead or experiencing them in some other way, and how this benefits bereavement and coping, or how this impacts on other people as well that have these experiences that aren't necessarily going through any form of bereavement. And also flotation tank research, so looking at altered states of consciousness and specifically what we were doing at the University of Northampton with regards to these studies, the pilot that we ran, and where we're taking these to next. Psi Wars is the title of a book by Craig Wheeler, and I was involved in writing the foreword for the second edition. And although I've not done the kind of research that he has as a journalist and spent a number of years putting this work together and then recently updating it, I felt so passionately about his cause and what he was doing for parapsychology as a whole, but I suppose many areas of social science, but primarily in this case parapsychology, to try and expose and debunk, which I feel he did quite successfully, the problems that are going on with some of the media outreach for parapsychology, especially when different domains of the media and especially the internet have tried to have their say or control what the actual truth is about the research and where it is today. So kind of realizing that I spent all day on half energy, really tired, running after a 2-year-old and just been relieved of her, I then realized that I got this talk to do as well. So, I've thrown a few things together, and it's not my usual talk where I've probably got pages and pages of tables and data and things like that. I thought if I can go through a few kind of pictures and other things like that, and a little bit of the history of parapsychology, some of those images will jog some of my own personal experience and views on this. And hopefully that'll be an interesting take on things. So what I'm going to do next is share my screen. And so Psi Wars, data and communication versus beliefs. It was Craig who recently gave a talk as well to the Scientific and Medical Network. So people got to hear his take on things and his journey, and really well scripted, because Craig had written out exactly what he wanted to say. And it was quite nice in a way. It was a different talk. I liken it very much to people like Jack Hunter, where he's taking you through a script, the exact kind of story that he wants to deliver to the audience. So this one's a little bit different, but I really do want to push across this issue because, you know, look at what we're doing right now. Normally I would be up at the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre giving this talk. Instead, we are doing it via methods of the internet, and it's our go-to source for information sometimes when it comes to first searches. And we do those, you know, Googling, or if you're using any other search engine, we go to that and we look at what kind of sources actually come up. I'm always telling my students the power of books. It's so important to harness libraries and go to the authorities in books, especially if you want to know about a person. Biographies and autobiographies, they're really, really important. So facing anomalous phenomena with true skepticism, rational inquiry and reasoned evidence. And I always say that to the students as well. We teach skepticism and the skeptical method within parapsychology, certainly within our module at the University of Northampton. And I would refer to myself as a skeptical activist. A lot of my work has been in debunking, more so pseudoscience and pseudo-skeptics. I don't think science has any place for people that are arguing their grounds of data or what they think just purely on beliefs, or not really understanding the subject, when it's very clear that they don't know the full scope of their subject, and yet they're very passionate about the outcome or what they want the outcome to be, which I find very uncomfortable to listen to, but I'm no stranger to actually hearing those kinds of things. But that will become more clear as we go along. Not letting me advance the slide. Oh, there we go. I'll use it that way. So this is the new campus for the University of Northampton. This is Waterside Campus, and that is the learning hub where I am based. On the third floor, we have the Faculty of Health, Education and Society. Psychology is in there, and there are 3 main research groups in terms of the collective of the 35 to 40 psychologists and counsellors and psychotherapists that we have. And one of those groups is called Exceptional Experiences and Consciousness Studies, which you saw on the main title there. People within that group usually have a background or interest in things such as parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, so looking at religious and peak experiences, consciousness studies, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience as well. So this is now where we're based. And we also have specialized lab facilities in there as well, specifically for parapsychology. I thought this picture was quite unique. It also gives you the scope of how big it is on the inside. And that nice row of books right in front there, that first main shelf, is where some of the more popular parapsychology periodicals are. So I thought I'd throw that in. On the ground floor, we keep a lot of the main journals for the Journal of the Society of Psychical Research and Journal of Parapsychology and many others. And we're just having our archive brought onto campus. Originally, the archive for all of our old collections of reel-to-reel tapes, cassette tapes, things that were collected from ASAP, the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena, and also the Oxford University Society for Psychical Research, as it was when Sue Blackmore was running it. All of that collection that we have is now being brought on campus. So that's great for actually doing more archiving and also getting new potential students to actually use that unpublished data on things such as poltergeist cases and psychic healing. We have a lot of stuff for them to use there. So I've mentioned parapsychology. Let me just give you a brief definition of it for those of you not familiar, because I haven't given any particular slide on it. But parapsychology could be described as the study of human experiences or abilities that appear to be outside of the realm of current scientific understanding, or don't seem to fit any conventional scientific paradigm as it stands. So this could involve anything such as extrasensory perception, which would explore telepathy, precognition, and clairvoyance. Telepathy, mind-to-mind interaction; precognition, feelings or visions of things before they happen; and clairvoyance, seeing information at distance, such as remote viewing. Then we have a second category, psychokinesis or PK, being able to influence people or the environment via the power of the mind alone. This could be anything from maybe the sense of being stared at. When you believe that you can sense that someone has been staring at you, you turn and scan your environment, and you find that lo and behold, someone at some distance behind you has been staring in your direction. So was that stare actually influencing you in some way? or even through to manipulation of objects and metal. So the most popular one for that would be Uri Geller and the whole spoon bending phenomena and craze that happened, then spawning many mini Gellers that came forward, people that also claimed that they had this ability, and also some of those effects turning up in poltergeist cases as well. And then the third strand would be survival. And that's more traditional parapsychology, so that really stemmed from psychical research in the late 1800s, following 1840, the late 1840s with the Fox sisters in New York City, claiming all these bangs, raps and taps about the house, and then later spirit communication. A group of scholars at Trinity College, University of Cambridge, got together and started to look into all these claims of apparitions and hauntings and mediumship. And in 1882, they formed the Society for Psychical Research. And that was shortly followed by the American branch in around 1885, with prominent figures such as the psychologist William James being one of the main founders. So they were looking at all these claims, they were doing a lot of surveys, they were having people send in letters and going out and conducting interviews. But it wasn't until the 1920s that this branch of science started to actually gain a name for itself and wanted to gain scientific status as well. And that's thanks to the Rhines. So I want to tell you a bit more about them and the establishment of parapsychology as a science. And then that will lead into what's this problem with miscommunication of data. So if you'd like an overview of parapsychology, and especially its initiation, I would certainly recommend these two books. And I've tried to put in some book recommendations where possible. So Parapsychology, A Concise History by John Beloff. He was based at the University of Edinburgh and saw some of the first 5 or 6 PhDs in parapsychology through there before Bob Morris. And then also Unbelievable by Stacey Horn, which is in many ways a sort of a biographical account of the Rhines at Duke University and what happened there with parapsychology and its establishment as a science, and also some of the reception that it received as well. It's a very, very good book. So I will give you an overview of some of that, but by no means is it better than the 2 books that I've just mentioned. So that is J.B. Rhine, Joseph Banks Rhine, and Louisa Rhine. Seeing some little messages popping up. I'm not sure if someone's desperate to ask me a question right there. Chloe, is someone trying to ask me a question, or should I just keep going?
Hi, Cal. No, they're asking if it's possible for you to put your camera back on because they'd like to see you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hang on. I will do that. Hopefully. Hang on. Can you see me now?
Yep, can see you.
Okay. Yep. And just get this back up. Okay, if you can see me, I'll keep going. I can't see me, but...
Yep, you're fine. Thank you.
Fine. Okay, there we go. So J.B. Rhine is there and Louisa Rhine. So they were responsible for the professionalization of parapsychology. They had been members of the American Society for Psychical Research and had done a lot of field investigations into mediumship. They had this interest in spiritualism. They were also academics. They married quite young, and they both went to the University of Chicago for their academic studies. They gained some experience in psychology, but their PhDs were in botany, so plant biology. And it was later on that they would gain more knowledge and experience within statistical analysis, but they had gained that through their training. And they've been unimpressed during some of the early field investigations, more so because of some of the fraud that was taking place with certain mediums and how disheartening it actually became. So Stacey Horn mentioned that Rhine had been in correspondence with Albert Einstein, the famous physicist, and he had said that if you do get a particular instance of a medium where you think, my word, I can't find any conventional explanation of how they're doing what they're doing, be it through trance, so delivering information through themselves about other people, or more particularly the deceased, or a physical medium who's tied down perhaps to a chair in the seance room, and then all these things start moving around, let me know. If you're absolutely sure there's one of those mediums, then let me know. So 2 things happen really. There's that instance, And Ryan was working with, or spending a lot of time with a medium where he thought, yeah, I've got the perfect one here, time to get Albert Einstein in. And Albert Einstein came to visit this particular seance setting with Ryan present. The seance went ahead, as it normally would, with all the setup and people sitting in their particular places. And then nothing particularly of interest happened. And therefore, Albert Einstein's interest was lost entirely with doing any more of those sittings, which I think really infuriated Ryan. And, I suppose it's one of those moments where you think, what's the point? Another instance is of the medium Marjorie, who was known as Mina Crandon. Mina Crandon had gained a lot of popularity amongst the American Society for Psychical Research and certain researchers as well. Some of her reports were in favour of the phenomena that she was producing within the seance room, but then word got out amongst members that in these seances, perhaps more things were actually going on than meets the eye. It turned out that, or at least the claim was, she was offering sexual favours to certain people for a report in favour of her phenomena. And I think the Ryans were very much aware that this was going on, as were many other members as well of the American Society for Psychical Research. And this caused a split amongst its members in this period of the 1920s. And so half of the membership went off and formed the Boston Society for Psychic Research, while the others stayed behind, some in favour of Mina Crandon, others not really involved within that whole affair. They might be doing their own investigations of hauntings and apparitions, so it still had a membership base, with some still in favour of her mediumship and her abilities, and then others for wrong reasons as well. But the Boston Society for Psychic Research was formed with people like Dr. Walter Franklin Prince at the helm. And Ryan gained a lot of his popularity through that side branch before later on it reformed again, the American Society for Psychical Research, after this whole controversy to some extent was put behind them. But in the inaugural address for the Boston Society for Psychic Research, it was made very clear by Walter Franklin Prince that they wanted no dealings with this controversy that had taken place. They wouldn't lower themselves to being involved in anything like that, nor would they ever want to really engage with anything that was very clearly, as he stated, dogmatic skepticism. If you're already arguing with someone that is very emotionally grounded in what they want the outcome to be, without having any real knowledge about the topic, they haven't researched it as far as you would like, then there's no point in even starting to engage or trying to start an argument with them, because you're not going to change their mind. So it's really interesting that in the inaugural address, that was the main thing that he wanted to emphasize, besides why they'd formed in the first place. So this happened, and the Ryans were approached by a psychologist called William McDougall, who'd, and I may not be getting the history exactly right, but he'd been given a position essentially as a dean of the social sciences at Duke University, and asked the Ryans if they wanted to go with him. He'd find a position for them, particularly for the study of psychical research within the university setting, giving them free reins to establish it really as a science. It's fantastic in a way, because later down the line you see this large building that was theirs. I might have a slide on it next, maybe. Have I put that in? I thought I put pictures of it. There is a beautiful building still on campus to this day that was the Parapsychology Laboratory. And they adopted the term parapsychology, which had originally been used in Germany in the late 1800s. But they wanted this term to take it away from the branding of psychical research and any stigma attached, so that they wanted it to be classed among the social sciences. So instead of abnormal psychology, even though they were publishing such journals, some of the early studies, they have this term parapsychology, so beyond current psychology, or beyond current psychology understanding. And they wanted to try and take what they've been doing. So we've got all these claims of people having mediumship and witnessing hauntings and apparitions and telepathic phenomena. How do we actually get that into a setting where we can control it and look further at what's going on? So the Ryans needed to develop some form of structured methodology that would please not only the sciences, but also the skeptics out there. It was one of the main things that was asked in terms of what do we need to do? How do we need to establish ourselves? And the feedback was, you need to do something that would make you a structured science, something that shows a scientific element to how you go through this process to demonstrate what we would call here psi. So anything that encapsulates ESP, psychokinesis, or survival. They had a standard protocol It didn't use self-proclaimed psychics, but screen participants. You may be very familiar with these cards. These are what came out of their initial trials. So they were using packs of playing cards initially and using colours and suits. These cards here are the Zener cards. They had an academic at the university called Carl Zener, or Zener, to design some of these perception cards. I think the only one that ever really changed was the cross, which may have originally been a triangle. But I like this formation more when I talk to the students because it's got a 1 to 5 sequence. You've got 1 continuous line for the circle, you've got 2 for the cross, 3 wavy lines, 4 sides to a square, and 5 points to the star. And these were made fresh on campus. They would cut the cards, they had ink rollers for them. There are quite a few pictures kicking about of some of the original crude cards that they had, especially in volume 1 of the Journal of Parapsychology. And you had a 1 in 5 chance of getting one of these right by guesswork. And you still do. If you have a go with them, the chances haven't changed. But this helped with the structured methodology because it was too complex really to play around with the playing cards. So what you would do, I've got a pack here, there we go. Just so happens I keep some in my drawer, and these are the fancy ones. I've got some black ones here that are the opposite way around. So originally they would shuffle the pack up, and then, oh, this will be interesting actually, because some of you are commenting. There's no reflection behind. So it might be that the experimenter would be looking at the card as I am now, and I'm trying to send it to all of you. Chloe, what is this card? What do you think it is?
Star.
Well done, Chloe. So there we go. It would be like that, and people would do it over and over and over again. Each pack has 25 cards within it, so your chances of getting chance level out of the whole pack, you get 5 out of 25 on chance level, maybe 6. So that's our standard deviation. It allows for that 1 on 25. And if you did it 4 times over, so you went through 100 cards, the standard deviation then is 4. So that would mean our chance is 20 out of 100 just by guessing, and it would allow 4. So you'd still have to beat 24 out of 100 for it to start to become interesting. You're beating chance expectancy and going beyond that, and it becomes statistically significant. So what's going on there, if you can't put it down to recording error, fraud, sensory leakage, somehow they gained access to that information within the room, be it via reflections, or you can see the way in which the experimenter is writing their feedback down, and it's to do with the subtleties of the pencil. That's why they developed these things here, even the screens, to make sure the participant and the experimenter could see. They also had an extra experimenter sat to one side at one point, keeping track of the scores, just in case there was a recording error, which was causing some of the statistical outcomes. So mainly proof-orientated research, characteristics of trial, it was novel stimuli, these Zener cards, fixed length of runs and shuffles, physical separation between the sender and receiver, and independent recording and checking of data. Oh, my slides are working better now, I can press the button. So the first significant series came out between 1931 and 1932. They'd gone through 24 students who gave 207 hits in 800 trials with a mean chance expectancy of 160. So the associated p-value of that was very big, suggesting that it was going way beyond what chance would expect. We worked to a level in psychology, the standard p-value is 0.05, so that's 1 in 20. And if you can beat that, then seemingly something's going on in terms of what you're trying to measure. Some of Ryan's early trials were also working to 0.005, so trying to beat 1 in 200. And as you can see with this associated p-value, it was clearly doing that and more. And so the procedure evolved to prevent normal communication. So even as they started to publish the initial stuff, they were really, really wanting that criticism, just in case they weren't seeing something that was going on. This wasn't just J.B. Ryan, Joseph Banks Ryan, and Louisa Ryan. This is also research associates that they had on campus, other psychologists that were getting involved that wanted to be part of parapsychology, and also getting the statisticians involved to help them with these calculations initially and how to actually run through the process. and getting all kinds of feedback of how it can be done better. There were criticisms that maybe after each trial of 25, then someone is using sleight of hand to shuffle it in a certain way, so someone is becoming familiar with the sequence. And so later on, they had electric card shufflers introduced, so it would do an automatic shuffle and mix up the cards properly without any human hand actually being involved. They'd also have cards in sealed envelopes later on as well, which you can see there with Gaithia Pratt, who's laying out the cards, the participant selects them. And they were also testing other things. They were testing the blind. They were testing distance. So you would have one person in one room on campus, someone in a completely different room the other side of campus as well. So I mentioned that the Boston Society for Psychic Research really helped gain J.B. Ryan some profile, and it did. This book here, Extrasensory Perception, could be argued to be the very first textbook that came out on the topic, developing also the term extrasensory perception. It had an introduction by William McDougall, and then also Walter Franklin Prince wrote the introduction for it as well. And this talked about the process of how they got to where they were, and also the overall statistical outcomes and all the procedures that have been involved and developed. The main purpose was to demonstrate that this kind of claim could be tested empirically. And it is, and their main comment after they did this, and as you can see, some fantastic outcomes there with, look at those deviations. I mentioned this deviation from chance as well. They've gone through hundreds, if not here, thousands of trials. The problem with this is going through the Zener Cards that many times, it gets really, really boring. But they would get people that started to become quite good at it with training, and they just went over it again and again and again, and doing all these initial trials, first trying to get that structured method for ESP, it seemed to be a success. And so one of the final comments by J.B. Ryan was, it is independently established on the basis of this work alone that extrasensory perception is an actual and demonstrable occurrence. Two things happened around this time, maybe three actually. One was Ryan went to present some of these initial findings at a conference on psychology. And he was told just before he was about to do his presentation that someone had been sent in to cheat or had been cheating. And so he went out with some of his colleagues, and they had the raw data with them and looked for anything that was suspicious within the data. And I think they found someone that was answering in a particular way that suggested they were trying to work to a pattern to see if that would actually help them. I don't think it particularly did, but once they identified that person anyway, they removed the data and recalculated it, which still produced an overall significant effect. Scott Rogo had talked about this before with spontaneous cases, where what do you do if someone has given you an account of something, saying they've seen a ghost against another 50 or so people that make the same claim, but this person has been clearly making it up, or you've been told that. Well, their data gets blurred amongst the rest, really. It gets cancelled out by all the noise of everything else that's going on. So they start to become that significant outlier if indeed their account or their data doesn't match the honest. But even so, they recalculated it. And his talk, because of that, and the panic that he went through beforehand, didn't go all that well, and he didn't get the best of reception. He was also publishing in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology and Social Psychology around that time, this kind of data, and it didn't really get any reception, no real follow-up papers, no correspondence to editors. And so even though they'd had so much criticism about this, they weren't really getting any significant feedback to something that was seemingly remarkable. We've had all these real-world claims of this phenomena. Look, we can take it and test it in a laboratory. So when this book came out, it sold out. It was a bestseller. Beyond the Boston Society for Psychic Research publishing it, I think it was in the same year, if not early the following year, it got picked up by publishing houses in New York and got reprinted. And some of the initial reviews that came out for it were really, really good. They were astounding, saying, you know, that this is actually quite a fantastic piece of work. And the purpose of this book was for it to be a guide to other people at different universities. And instead of saying, look, we have demonstrated ESP, Ryan has more so said it on the case that we seem to have done it. We can't see anything else going on. It seems we've harnessed it, we've controlled it, and we've used through statistical science a method that seems to show ESP. Try it for yourself. Here's the method. Here's how to calculate it. But if you can think of anything else in terms of how to better these studies or a fatal flaw in it, please let us know. And that's where establishing parapsychology then started to move forward. I don't know if I put it in. No, I haven't. I'll go back. So a few things happened beyond that. They realized that they needed to collect this kind of feedback. So in 1937, they established their own journal that was printed by Duke University, and that was the Journal of Parapsychology. And so its main purpose was to try and get all these other people that were involved, had an interest. Don't publish your research necessarily in one of the wider journals, because it might just get lost and we won't know about it. Publish back in the Journal of Parapsychology, peer-reviewed, and specific interest is for these kinds of studies, and then people can make a significant advancement by looking at these studies, critiquing them, responding to the editors, doing replications as well. And that was the important thing. The Journal of Parapsychology, much like the Journal of the Society of Psychical Research, they've always had the premise of publishing replications and any studies that don't find anything. You will find in a lot of mainstream journals, even to this day, that they're not interested in replications and won't publish them, or any study that hasn't found something as well. That's a whole different debate really for a different time, but it does lead to a lot of confusion, and also that's a controversy in itself in terms of how fair, honest and open we're being with scientific findings. I think Chris Rowe had mentioned before that he was involved in some capacity on a clinical psychology thesis. I don't know if he was examining it or something like that, but it had, I don't know if it had about 12 studies or so, it was something like that, and only 2 or 3 of them were successful. And they went on to getting them published, but guess which ones were the only ones that were allowed to be published? It was the ones that found something. Again, I think the more interesting thing there is the majority that didn't find anything. So why was that, and what's going on there? So we still have this same issue even cropping up to this day that was going on even at around the time of the Journal of Parapsychology being established. They also formed the Parapsychological Association in the 1950s. This was to create a professional body for parapsychology as well. So anyone that was involved in this research could sign up. It got them listed as members and professional members as well. And it needed that as well, I suppose, to keep tracks of everything that was going on around the world in terms of any other university-based research for parapsychology. And again, to give it that status, an official association that was managing the science and trying to make it grow. And by 1969, the American Association for the Advancement of Science picked it up as an affiliate branch, and it still is to this day. So the Parapsychological Association is an affiliate of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. For many people, that's enough. That's enough to say, okay, it is an established science, no matter what I actually think of the phenomena that parapsychology looks at. Because it could be that there is no such thing as telepathy and mind extending beyond the body to gain that information, but it's still testing the claim in a structured scientific manner. And that was the important thing that they were trying to do. Even around that time, though, with all the shielding, looking for alternative explanations, trying to rule out all fraud, error, and cheating, it only seems within the scope of their studies that they were actually harnessing what seems to be telepathy and people obtaining information without access to that known information by any conventional means. So it seems we have this extrasensory process going on. So I've shown some of my students this, and I think it's a great kind of example of the kinds of arguments that could take place. Certainly, Ryan put up with a lot of criticism going on in popular magazines, not necessarily within the Journal of Parapsychology. Certainly the correspondence section of the journal can hold quite a lot of really interesting debate, and it got more and more heated by the 60s and 70s when you got people arguing over different things, and it's great to read how some of these arguments take place. But perhaps from the wider scientific community, and certainly those not involved in parapsychology, and also general public reaction as well. The Rhines had a lot of people writing to them, especially about their everyday alleged psychic occurrences. It became so much so that they were getting phone calls even at 3 a.m. to their own house with people wanting to explain their experiences because the parapsychology lab at Duke University got so much attention. So Louisa Rhines spent much of her time collecting, analysing, cataloguing spontaneous cases, and that's what she became more famous for. And I suppose developing in many ways qualitative methodology, so analysing written scripts and these reports, while Rhine spent much of his time focused on these lab-based studies. And so all kinds of arguments could come out for what they were doing. And I think this is especially important when we look at the internet. If you go on YouTube and you look at the comment section, when you get involved in a group on Facebook that's asked a question and people start replying, some of the arguments that take place. I saw one today where someone had commented on a picture that came out of the singer Ozzy Osbourne, how now he is using a walking stick more and he's decided not to dye his hair anymore, he's let it go grey, and he was a bit bent over in this photo, and someone made a very honest, and it wasn't meant to be negative anyway, but they just said that, you know, they were sad to see him aging, but we all do. And someone took it so personally, and it just created this long debate where it was just name calling, really. But you even get that in science because we're all human, and some people do have personal investments in outcomes and topics, and this could be because of their religious backgrounds, their cultural backgrounds, family beliefs that they were raised on, or also their own education and what they've been brought to believe through their science education, perhaps. Some people are taken through science and told to really focus on a materialistic point of view of science, and that is the only way. Whereas we have all these kinds of phenomena going on, not just for parapsychology, that suggest that maybe the materialist approach isn't the right one because of, for example, case in point, extrasensory perception and the data surrounding that. So these are the kinds of things in Graham's hierarchy of argument. The very basic form of argument you might expect is just pure name calling. Sounds something like you're an asshat. And then there could be attacks on the characteristics or authority of the writer without addressing the substance of the argument. So attacking their character and other things about them, and moving well away from what the argument is actually about. Then also criticizing the tone of writing without addressing the substance of the argument, spelling mistakes and pointing those out, and then making the whole argument about the fact that the person has not put an apostrophe in the right place, or they've misspelt a word. In the heated debate of someone typing, either on their laptop or on their phone, trying to respond to someone and have a decent debate, the other person seemingly is struggling to handle it and finds anything else that they can pick holes in. States the opposing case with little or no supporting evidence. So that can happen as well. I've heard loads of people saying, you know, it's not happening, or no, it isn't, because it's just a fact. So they're being very reasonable in terms of their tone, but they're just saying, oh, it's a fact that there's no such thing as evidence for psychic phenomena. It's a fact. There is no such evidence. Okay, well, can you demonstrate what you mean by that, or anything that's been written to demonstrate what you're saying? No, it's just well known that there is no such evidence. You know, it might go like that. Contradicts and then backs up with the reasoning and or supporting evidence. So that would be quite good. I'll come back to those. Finds the mistake and explains why it's mistaken using quotes. That's quite good as well. And then explicitly refutes the central point. I think that's where it's gone too far, but someone right at the top of the pyramid could be a very well-educated person in terms of knowing about science or whatever topic it is that they're dealing with, but not necessarily the other side of the coin that's actually creating the to and fro of the debate. They're so hardwired in their side of things that are going on that they just don't want to accept anything else that's coming in, and they're just batting out everything else. And so I think the best place to be really is in refutation and also counter argument as well, where, you know, you can contradict what the other person is saying, but then you're backing it up with that reasoned evidence and supporting what you're saying. Or you can find a mistake in something like what the Rhines were asking for. You know, here's a study, looks really good, statistical outcomes really good. Someone looks at it and says, okay, yeah. Regarding your methodology, did you try this, or did you just do it this way? Because doing it this way, I think there's room for error here. Is there or isn't there? And actually, I think you should put this in place. That will be interesting where people are making those alternatives and suggestions. That's a good debate leading to good progression as well, where you're actually getting something constructive out of it. I've been putting these slides together for a long time on the side, and I was just picking up things that really kind of touched me on this topic. And I liked this one. It really made me think of armchair skeptics, or also the pseudo-skeptics in some case when it comes to parapsychology. Critics, they watch it every night, but they can't do it themselves, says Oscar Wilde. And I think you can really relate that in the case of science and also parapsychology. There are a lot of people that speak out against parapsychology and yet have not done research themselves. They're not involved in the same capacity as parapsychologists. They've not necessarily done any studies at universities, and they've not necessarily published even if they did it independently, published in any of the journals, any of these studies. A lot of the time, they're just waiting for a study to come out that someone has spent a lot of time putting in a research bid for, getting the money, being able to do it, and it's a one-shot deal because that fund might be so small. So regardless of the outcome, positive finding or negative, it's got to be published, and it goes out there, and it could have taken a year, maybe 2 years in the making to get that one study done, and it just gets kind of blown out of the water by one person that's waiting for it, reads it and says, oh, it's all nonsense because. And usually these criticisms are quite old hat. There's quite a contrast when you read between journals such as the Journal of Parapsychology and, say, the Sceptical Inquirer. I subscribe to both, and I like to see the for and against of what people are saying, especially when debates move away from the Journal of Parapsychology and end up in the Sceptical Inquirer. And sometimes there's a lot of force and aggression behind what's being said in some of the articles of the Sceptical Inquirer, but sometimes these are people that are unknown to me in parapsychology, but they avidly read about the research and have a lot to say. And you can see sometimes in some of these articles, I'm not pinpointing any particular one, but I've seen from casually reading, they don't seem to be fully aware of the dynamics of doing these studies and what they're like and actually being there. And there's a lot of kind of gaps missing in their argument in terms of being fully aware of the literature. And also, I suppose, the processes of social science and the methodology involved. So it's all very well to voice an opinion on research. It's a different thing to be doing it. If you want to talk the talk, then walk the walk. Most critics are just opinion-based and nothing more. So I do try to say this to my students to reassure them, not just for parapsychology, but psychology in general. There was this whole debate that's been going about for years saying that parapsychology has not gained itself status as a structured science because it's got a problem with replication. Whereas only 3 or 4 years ago that in The Psychologist, the magazine of the British Psychological Society, they published a summary on a large-scale study that had been done to look at some of the most popular psychology studies that have been done to do replications on them. And it was found that only 30% of them were found to be replicable in that mass replication. So it was showing that there's a number of studies within social science that don't seem to be as hardwired as we actually think they are. I've always found the argument that parapsychology has no good replication effect a bit flaky, because I've been involved for a long time and I've been involved in a lot of lab studies. For one example, we had a remote viewing paper that came out recently, all driven by Professor Chris Rowe. That came out in the recent Journal of Parapsychology, looking at all 3 studies and the pilot study that was done. All of those were successful studies. They all developed one after the other. The pilot was successful, the methodology changed, we ran that, and then after that, and it being successful, the methodology developed even more to try and tighten things and also explore other questions as well that we hadn't yet answered and wanted to know more about. But I've seen this with other studies as well, where actually you look at it overall and it's pretty good. There's been a lot of meta-analyses recently as well that show the overall effects of healing studies and Gansfeld. Conan was most famous for developing the Gansfeld, but also showing meta-analyses for it, and how overall, failures and successes in there, it has a really good effect overall. For parapsychology, it is very much comparable to the rest of psychology, if not better, in its overall effect for these studies. This has been said by people such as statistician and parapsychologist Jessica Utz. She said that in her inaugural address to the American Statistical Association, and also Etzel Cardenia. He published an overall summary of parapsychological findings in the American Psychologist, which is the American version of the British Journal of Psychology. I might mention later, or you might ask questions on that as to what happened, but his paper got an instant response from Jim Olcott, who's always been a kind of an avid skeptic towards parapsychology, but his response was mainly opinion-based. And even though Etzel had presented all the empirical data to show how good parapsychology was doing, Jim's response was based on, well, ultimately, it's not doing that well because theoretically, psi shouldn't exist. That was, in summary, what he was saying. And it was a very strange argument, I think, to come out with, in terms of Etzel had spent all this time putting this paper together and getting it somewhere so significant. And yet the response is, well, you're wrong because technically, theoretically, it shouldn't be happening. So it isn't. And this then spawned more response. There was an entire issue of the Journal of Scientific Exploration talking about Jim's response and Etzel's initial paper. And also Professor Chris Rowe wrote a presidential letter for the Society of Psychical Researchers Paranormal Review talking about this debate as well. I'll tell you exactly what Jessica said at the presidential address that she had for the American Statistical Association. And I think it's really quite impactful. She got a big round of applause at the end, and I think it was great that in her position she was talking about parapsychology data. For many years, I've worked with researchers doing very careful work in parapsychology, including a year that I spent full-time working on a classified project for the United States government to see if we could use these abilities for intelligence gathering during the Cold War. At the end of that project, I wrote a report for Congress stating that I still think is true. The data in support of precognition and possibly other related phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if it pertained to something more mundane. And yet, most scientists reject the possible reality of these abilities without ever looking at data. And on the other extreme, there are true believers who base their beliefs solely on anecdotes and personal experience. I have asked the debunkers if there is any amount of data that would convince them, and they generally have responded by saying probably not. I asked them what original research they have read, and they mostly admit that they haven't read any. Now there is a definition of pseudoscience, basing conclusions on belief rather than on data. So some of these people that have a platform that don't really know fully to the full extent the data, and they don't know the published history of parapsychology, it does become dangerous if they hold public platforms and thus influencing public perception as well. John Cleese, I will mention a bit more about John Cleese, but John Cleese is very much of Monty Python and Fawlty Towers. He is very much interested in parapsychology. He is there with Dean Radin, the author of this book, Real Magic, and has been very supportive of the work that Dean and indeed parapsychology has been doing for a long time. Many of you might not know that he sponsored this book, The Irreducible Mind, that was more or less promoting, I suppose, science that was beyond materialism. So anything that was suggesting dualism and mind extending beyond the body and acting independently. And so we had this first anthology, which has more recently produced its, not really a second edition, but a second volume, as it were, called Beyond Physicalism. And the same publishing company also produced, I suppose, its counter advocate. It was the Myth of the Afterlife as well. I think all of these books are really important, but if you're going to buy just two, Beyond Physicalism and The Myth of the Afterlife, they're really interesting to read between the two. In terms of The Myth of the Afterlife is largely looking at this materialist perspective and neuroscience and how, look, if we've got all this data on our understanding of mind and body, how could ESP or life after death possibly occur at all? As it were, it could be all these other possible things. We've got all these other conventional explanations. From what we know of scientific exploration, we don't think the mind can actually extend beyond the body in the way that people perceive it to. Now, Beyond Physicalism is questioning those ideas, but also harnessing neuroscience at the same time to show changes in the brain and changes in brainwave states as well, to say, look, there is this possibility, and neuroscience actually helps this process of understanding potential mind-body separation. It doesn't really cut dead. But because of that, I think both books really reach a brick wall, and it's not really the end of it, but they need to chip away at the bricks to see if they can get through to the other side. They haven't actually either reached any sort of conclusion yet, but they bring us up to the present day and where we are. How am I doing for time? Chloe, am I doing okay for time? I haven't got any watch or indicator near me.
You're about 20 past, so you're fine.
Oh, okay. I'm not doing bad to say that. I wasn't really sure what I was going to include in this. But Rupert Sheldrake has become very well known for talking about the evidence for telepathy through research that he's done specifically, and also with the book Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. And he's also been very good with speaking out about pseudo-skepticism as well. In fact, this particular edition of his book, there are many editions of Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. It's been very popular, but this particular one by Three Rivers Press is my favorite as a fully updated and revised edition, because there is an entire appendices section that isn't in the other versions called Controversies and Inquiries. And it's Rupert's response to all the studies that were done on the dogs that suggested that something was going on in terms of extrasensory perception taking place. Rupert has a history of this in terms of testing animals. He's looked at seemingly telepathic parrots. He's looked at homing instinct in pigeons. That especially came up in one of his earlier books, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. And he goes through various individuals that have looked at the data seemingly or done replications. I mean, one most popular one in there is James Randi, who I don't know, well, I can't find the exact quote, but what he said was he'd gone to a popular dog magazine and had said that he'd done replications of Rupert's studies and found that nothing actually was going on at all. And so Rupert pursued him and wanted to know where these studies were published or even look at the raw data for it. It took a while. He emailed the James Randi Educational Foundation. And to mention, James Randi is most famous for his attempts over the years at debunking Uri Geller, with James Randi being an escapologist and also a magician, stage magician, and Uri Geller's background also being in stage magic as well. James Randi has been forever trying to tell the public, look, he is nothing more than a conjurer and magician, much like myself. I can do the same thing. Therefore, that's what Uri has been doing. And he's been deceiving the public. But he was having a go with Rupert in this instance, said that he'd done these replications and they found nothing. Rupert pursued his people. And eventually they said, look, James, I think you better reply to what Rupert is asking for. You've made a claim about his data and also your data. You need to answer. So he did, and it was very sheepish in the response, saying that, well, actually, he'd exaggerated the claim in the article quite a bit. He'd borrowed a friend's video camera and lent it to someone else to then film a friend's dog. I think a dog that hadn't been noted for actually waiting at the door when the owner was coming home. And it was by no means an experiment. It was someone in the afternoon just filming a dog in a house to see how it would react. It wasn't set up in any way like a Rupert study. Essentially, he got an apology out of him, but that doesn't take back the fact that this article had already gone out saying that replications had been done in the dispute of what Rupert had done, which wasn't the case at all. How Rupert had set this was quite interesting. He got locked off cameras in the house of JT, this particular dog that belonged to his research assistant's family, that had been noted for this behavior, and many other people also note this in their own dogs. And Pam would go out to the shops and she was called at a random time. So it wasn't any particular routine of the week that JT would be familiar with. She was out there at the shops, called at a random time to come home, and then she had to go and get a taxi. So a vehicle that she wasn't familiar with, nor was JT familiar with the sound of that particular vehicle pulling up on the drive. And it's out of JT's routine, if indeed there was one. And when you look at the footage, it is quite remarkable that JT, at the point that she's told to go home, Pam's told to go home, JT changes his behavior, starts going looking at the window. And I think 5 or 10 minutes before she finally gets home, has gone to place himself by the door. So there were some instances as well where JT wasn't following that behavior, but in terms of the majority of instances, and the statistical outcome is very much in favor that that's the behavior that JT was correctly displaying. And then there's been many other studies besides that with other dogs. Rupert made this point that I thought was so hard-hitting, where he was speaking to the Institute for Art and Ideas in 2016 on a panel called Missing Evidence. And he was on there with a philosopher who at the time, I think has changed his opinion now, but was very skeptical towards parapsychology. But I certainly think he has no involvement whatsoever from what I know of the guy. I'd certainly never heard of him before. But he was trying to give alternatives for this evidence that Rupert was talking about in terms of the dogs, sense of being stared at, telephone telepathy. So when you get a call from someone that you are thinking of that perhaps doesn't call regularly and the phone rings and you think it's them and it turns out to be them. Again, a lot of good statistical outcomes for those. He got the last word in this panel debate, and it's on YouTube, so do look it up with that title that I put at the bottom. And it got a good audience applause and a bit of laughter, because he was getting all these comments fired at him saying, you know, no, it's nonsense, and we live in this materialist world and materialist science all the way. And they were really trying to dispute what he was saying with regards to ESP. And he said, just getting it in there, what I can't get is, I don't go around denouncing physical chemistry or denouncing astrophysics. Why do people who know nothing about subjects feel so strongly? They form organizations to denounce it and oppose it. And I think that is such an important point. A lot of the organizations, skeptical organizations, that try and denounce things such as parapsychology as a whole, still for them seeing it as a pseudoscience and not seemingly knowing anything about the structured methodology that it developed, they feel so strongly about it. And yet when they talk out about it, you realize that they don't seem to know the subject all that well, or about the methodology, or its history. They have just these common assumptions about it. And so yeah, I had something else that came to my mind then that I was going to throw in. It might come back to me, but I think that is such an important point. And it does frustrate me sometimes when I talk to people, be it on radio or face-to-face, when I mention what I do in parapsychology, and you do get a lot of sweeping assumptions, with people not even thinking that such studies have ever taken place, or people saying that the military studies into psychic soldiers was an absolute flop and there were never any successes and never any reports or studies published on it, so that's all a bit weird. That's not true at all. Recently, the 3 or 4 volumes regarding the Stargate project, with Dr. Edwin May heavily involved in those, they recently came out. There's a summary of that book called Psi Wars, East and West, that he wrote with people like Lloyd Auerbach. So all of these things did actually take place, and there were great successes within them. But there's a lot of sweeping assumptions because of the media as well, and any documentaries that come out. Rupert was giving a talk about telepathy and the outcomes for it at TEDx. And when word got out after the initial panel of people involved in TED agreed to it, there was some people on the panel that didn't like it, the idea of talking about telepathy and the evidence for it because of being so hardwired in materialism, and some public backlash on it. But the vast majority of the public wanted this kind of talk. And so when his talk got banned because they thought it was a little step too far for free talking about science, it was banned. And this is one of the main things that Craig talks about in terms of the process of it becoming unbanned and getting on YouTube. There was loads of back and forth and loads of forum debates and letters written saying, why, if he's done something under structured methodology and he's got the statistical outcomes to present and explain this to the audience, what's so controversial about that? The only thing that's controversial is that it goes against materialist science. And some people were just dead against it. And you do think back to Graham's hierarchy of argument, where people are thinking on that scale, and why it's upsetting some people so much when they don't want to actually at least first hear one side of the debate, have Rupert have his say, and then respond appropriately. You could write articles, you could get involved in debates afterwards and all sorts. That was the thing that I was going to mention that I'd forgotten. After the Ryans developed this methodology, and even some of the development of qualitative methods as well, social science adopted a lot of these methodologies that are still used to this day. Wasn't criticised for them using it at all, because again, the topics they largely deal with, most people would consider them mundane. But because parapsychology is dealing with telepathy and people's experiences of apparitions and all these other things as well, these seem so fantastical. They're certainly not mundane at all. So there was still criticism saying, well done, you've created this methodology, but topic's still a bit, ooh, so no, it's not really science, is it? Is it? So you have this kind of attitude going on. Well, have your methodology, because that's really good. What a brilliant way of controlling something and then measuring how much something is or isn't occurring. The same thing also happened for Russell Targ. He's a physicist. His background was in laser technology. He was also involved with Hal Puthoff in the initial studies of Uri Geller and looking at what was going on there. His talk at a smaller TED event was on the evidence for remote viewing, with studies that he'd done in that and the outcomes for it. That got banned. It later got re-released. The backlash to all of this is that both of these videos now have had over 1 million views on YouTube because of all this controversy surrounding it. The more recent controversy that crept up with them both was there was a lot of public outcry and negativity surrounding a TED talk that had taken place regarding paedophilia and attitudes towards that, and some research that had been done on it. And some people related it back to the banning of talks on telepathy. And they said, why on earth has this talk on paedophilia and its controversial views been allowed to go ahead? And yet there was so much hoo-ha about banning a talk on presenting the evidence for telepathy. So that was a recent controversy. I'm not expressing any particular opinion on what took place there. I need to read into it more, but certainly that was the latest news on TED getting into hot water around these topics and what does and doesn't get banned and what gets out there. So Craig Weiler in 2013 presented a book. He privately published it through Amazon called Psi Wars. He's a journalist by profession, and in terms of this, he's actually a building contractor. Sorry, he's a journalist for parapsychology, and had been documenting its history. He'd been writing about it, and saw some of these issues cropping up. He saw about problems with TED and the banning going on. He saw the James Randi Educational Foundation, and James Randi's, what was originally the $10,000 prize, became the $1 million prize for any person that could come forward with their abilities and demonstrate it through James Randi's trials. He exposed the corruption behind it and the processes you have to go through to even get to the final stage. It's very much like what goes on in the X Factor before you finally get to the judges for what appears to be the initial audition. So he tried to expose the corruption behind that, and also how it became a very tricky situation for some people making claims of heads I win, tails you lose. And then also Wikipedia, which I'm sure many people listening to this are familiar with, in terms of if you go on Wikipedia and you look up parapsychology or topics related to it or biographies, they are pretty poor. They're edited by people we don't know in the field. The talk pages are very interesting in terms of the arguments that take place, especially when authorities are trying to go in and edit their pages. And they often end on a very negative note that isn't really true or is very, very misleading and sends any reader in the direction of, they did all of this, but it was nonsense. They did all of this, but they were a fraud. They did all of this, however, they were a bad person because, and it always sends you down that route. Russell Targ, who I just mentioned, he had the entirety of his background on laser technology removed. I think partly that made him look too scientific and too well grounded in physics to really be involved in parapsychology. But there are many biographies on there that are very defamatory. I once tried to change J.B. Ryan's biography because there's a few comments. One was that Zener Cards studies are never used in universities anymore, or no one dabbles with them. Well, we do every year at Northampton. We use them to show basic statistics to students. That's not entirely true, and there are also computer-based programs for that now, if anyone ever wanted to follow up the Zener Cards studies. There was also comments saying that all of his studies had been disputed because someone had spotted a fatal flaw in all the statistical analyses, and therefore none of Ryan's previous work can be trusted in any way, shape or form, even though he was the founding father for parapsychology. I thought, it changes all the time. So at the time I thought, what a sweeping statement, and I went in and corrected it. I got banned within 5 minutes and told not to do it again. One of the comments that I got sent directly when I said, look, I am an authority on this. This is my profession. I teach this all the time. I have a parapsychology module that I lead. Apologies for the swearing, but this is the exact quote that I got sent. Nobody gives a fuck that you are the dog. If the vast majority of people think that that is the case and that is truth, then it will remain as truth on here. Nobody takes Wikipedia seriously as an authority, coming from the Wikipedia editors involved in that. So as I said, these are the main things that Craig wanted to expose. Ban TED Talks, Randi's $1 million prize, and then also Wikipedia and its control. They even have a page on Wikipedia for the guerrilla skeptic movement, as they call themselves, which are groups of people that go about all these topics, editing them and having them structured in a way that suits them. Again, not people known in the field. They certainly don't seem to be all that well read in it. They're not allowed to reference first-hand sources, which is the general rule anyway for Wikipedia. So you get some very obscure references to armchair skeptics. I think there was also the comment for the general parapsychology page that the vast majority of scientists believe parapsychology to be a pseudoscience. And you look at the reference that they put, there's like 2 or 3 backing it up, and it's really weak, where again, it's come from the armchair skeptic, when actually I've got loads of surveys over here, just in the Journal of Parapsychology and in the Skeptical Inquirer, where they went out, people have done this a lot of at times over the previous decades, interviewing or surveying scientists asking about ESP, and it's actually the vast majority of them that do favour Psi and do believe in parapsychology as a science. They may have other problems with it and stuff like that, but as an outsider looking in, So they've got these assumptions and wariness, but who hasn't when you're facing or being asked about science you don't know about? So these are just absolute nonsense claims, but they're being used, some of these comments, statements and quotes, to back up leading statements on a search engine, which a lot of people now, especially young people, will get out their phones, Google something, and that'll be their first port of call for obtaining this knowledge. So it's important that these things are exposed. And the problem is now, in a lot of forums as well, you talk out about this and you instantly become a quotation for them as well, which again, as I've seen, you'll talk and you'll be very confident about what you're saying, but they'll twist what it is you're saying in the quote that they want to use. I've recently watched the American version of The Office. I love the British version, but I watched the American one. And this is the boss of the American Office, Michael Scott. And he said this in one of his face-to-face interviews to Cameron. And I laughed out loud when I heard it. And he was speaking with such confidence. But they clearly put it in as a joke. And people need to kind of appreciate that satire. Wikipedia is the best thing ever. Anyone in the world can write anything they want about any subject. So you know you're going to get the best possible information. I just thought that was brilliant. But then that links back to people like Ricky Gervais, Stephen Merchant, who wrote it. And Ricky Gervais has got very particular opinions on the internet. Chris Rose spoke out about this problem. I am coming to the end. He gave his 2017 presidential address in Athens on withering skepticism. And this was inspired by writings of Chuck Honiton just before he died in around 1991, 92. And Chuck had looked at skepticism and its state, and he'd analysed feedback from Sue Blackmore and two other skeptics at the time regarding the current state of evidence for parapsychology. And instead of just responding to their criticisms, he actually analysed their responses and said, look, here is a problem with current day skepticism. Looking at your responses, the arguments are the same arguments that were taking place by skeptics. And I say that in quotes because I am a skeptic, but these are people that have a different seat of skepticism in a way, as I say, the armchair skeptic, or they're coming from a different direction, a different topic area, but they still want a proper debate. And then we've got the pseudo-skeptics that won't listen to reason. But he said, look, their arguments have not changed, and yet our methodologies and our responses to skepticism have, and we've moved a long way since then. So our response to skepticism needs to be, thanks very much for your response, but you're wrong. Please keep up with us. You're miles behind now. You need to bring your own skepticism up to date. What you're saying has already been gone and been addressed. Now change the tone, change the tune, and start singing from a different hymn sheet. Find out something else that's going on, and tell us about that criticism that you've come up with. So Chris's response was, we do need skepticism though, especially for parapsychology. It's healthy for us, it keeps us on our toes, because we do need to address flaws and other things that are going on, and we need to learn to respond. We have to engage with it in the most sensible and professional way that we can. Arguing on the internet, I think, though, is never going to get you anywhere. And this is where Ricky Gervais, the comedian here and writer, has a really interesting point to say about when the internet really gets too much for you, how you have to step away. The internet is shouting out of a window and it's reading every toilet wall in the world at once. You won't go and argue with graffiti. You won't go up to a toilet wall and shout the blah, 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 blah. Why did you say that? And get outraged about what you've seen on the toilet wall written there. Why get outraged at what you've seen on the internet? It is just the internet, and there are loads of trolls on there, self-opinionated people, and some of these armchair skeptics and the pseudo-skeptics. What's the point? Well, for trolling, the negativity, remember, it's the internet. We've become used to the vast amounts of pointless, uninformed voices shouting out that ends up captured within its web. We get very frustrated if we get caught up in that web as well. Walk away, go to the books, go to the journals, go to the first-hand sources, go to the authorities, get involved in a good structured debate. Places like these search engines for wiki and going on some of the forums on Facebook and stuff like that, you can find some very nasty backlashes or comments or things that are outright lies when you look at the first-hand sources. Don't get frustrated by it. Things might make a change in the future, but this is the current state of play. And we have to be very careful when we look at the media and what it's saying about science and where it is now, particularly parapsychology, and the actual truth behind what the authorities are saying and what the published information is saying. It's not translating correctly. And I think the two need to marry up a lot better. There's a lot of producers and radio hosts that are really, really wanting to actually get this information out properly, but we need other sources as well to do this. But in some places it won't change when you're dealing with people. Ultimately, if they've got hardwired views against it, then if they're in control of that forum, it's not really going to change. So they have a very dangerous platform. So all we can do besides that is become aware of these issues. If we're aware of these issues, we can inform other people about these problems as well, so they can at least understand whether they agree or not. Finally, we shouldn't take what we hear in the news too seriously, because most, oh, sorry, this is a comment from John Cleese. We shouldn't take too seriously what we hear in the news too seriously, because most of them have no idea what they're talking about. So he's referring to people like wiki editors and journalists. The more anxious we are, the more we hang on to our beliefs. If you think of the fundamentalists, the way they hang on to their beliefs, they miss the point. If you really are out there thinking we can change this place into something other than a madhouse, Wikipedia, then I think you're basically wasting your energy. But if you can make 12 or 15 people's lives just a little bit better in some small way, then I think you're doing your job. Most critics have no idea what they're talking about. And of course, they have no idea that they have no idea what they are talking about. With that, thank you very much. To say I just thrown a load of pictures together, I probably overrun when I thought I'd probably only take 20 minutes. I'll come back to the normal screen now, but there is my website if you want to email me, and I can wave any books again on camera. Stop sharing screen. There we go.
Thank you very much, Cal, for your talk.
Thank you.
So there are a few questions. I'm going to read out the first question, which is 3 for 2, really. So this is from Claire Murphy Morgan, and she's saying there's a movement on the internet towards sharing comments in favour of post-materialist scientific views in comment threads on social media. So with this in mind, what are the challenges in terms of ensuring that the comments shared are accurate or presented in a helpful way online? And how does this link with social media literacy more widely? Now, I'm just going to read the whole thing because there's quite a lot of points she wants to make. She's saying, also, as Sheldrake has pointed out, the terminology re paranormal and parapsychology is potentially problematic in terms of othering psychical research. What are your views on this?
Parapsychology is a term, even though it tried to use it to create that basis for an established science, it's now got its own stigma attached to it because of what it studies and tries to look at. Regardless of the truth claim behind the phenomena. And so Rupert is right when he speaks out about paranormal and supernatural. I hate those terms as well, and I try to bat them back. I did an article for a magazine recently where I always ask them to send a proof of what they've written about me when they've interviewed me before it goes out, and they were using terms such as that, and as though I'd said it, and I said, no, I would never use that term. You know, if the vast majority of people, when surveyed, will say that they've had a telephone telepathy experience or sense of being stared at, sometimes they come up at 70%, then it's not paranormal and it's not supernatural. It's normal and it's natural. What is paranormal is the minority don't seem to be able to relate in their lifetime to ever having one of these experiences once. So what's going on there? I'd like to know more about their belief systems and their way of thinking about these phenomena, and a number of other things. But it's interesting to know that we've got that 70%, even though there could be loads of conventional explanations for why they're having that experience. How do we deal with this on the internet? At the moment, cyber psychology is really starting to grow and looking at all sorts of things online, gambling addiction, porn addiction, online bullying and all sorts. And online bullying does actually have some of this within its scope. Claire has asked this question, a very detailed one. I'm very pleased she has, because we are working on this together at the moment. Claire's background is in Afterlife belief scales from Northumbria University, Newcastle, and we kind of found this common ground of interest of how this is all delivered on the internet and in different forums. And so you will just get people that are at the bottom of Graham's hierarchy on, say, YouTube comments saying, oh, Rupert Sheldrake, well, you know, why would I listen to him? He's a bloody idiot. Well, you've just come onto YouTube, onto his video, just to write that. Did you not watch any of it? Did you really just take your time to do that? What does that add to anything? There are some useful comments in there, and you can create good dialogue. I tell my students to go and watch some videos and documentaries sometimes and comment below and start a good dialogue going. But you can start to piece out some of these comments and place them on Graham's hierarchy of argument, and also make comparisons as well. It's not the best place or the ultimate place to actually have any scientific dialogue, but you can actually see some decent stuff seeping through out of it, besides I enjoyed that video or I thought that video was stupid. But what we need to do is look at how people interact in those environments where science is being delivered and the public are being able to have a voice and engage, and then talk about it more widely. So that's why we are analysing it. We do want to actually do some papers on analysing the way people interact in these forums, and then say blogs as well on Facebook, and then also talk out about them, go to different science conferences and talk about these ways in which people react to people studying certain things, because it's only casually spoken about at this point. No actual studies have been carried out analysing the way people interact. I had one recently on Facebook where there was a consciousness studies group, and someone had asked a simple question. It was the height of lockdown. I was really annoyed with myself for many reasons and what I was seeing in the news with riots going on. I thought, you know what, I'm gonna act here. I've seen a comment that says, might sound like a silly comment, but is there any real evidence for psychic phenomena or psychic functioning? And I thought, you know what, I'm the person there to answer that. So I went in, and I had about 5 or 6 people that were on top of me, on top of my case. And some of them claimed they were professional illusionists, mentalists, and other ones say that they had a psychology background, and looking at them that they were recent psychology graduates, and they were just dead against the idea. Now, could they actually argue back against the data and the references I was putting? Because I said I was involved in these studies or I knew the data. And they said, well, where's the evidence? I gave them the reference. And they said, well, that's just nonsense. And then they started coming out with a number of things. They questioned my university and where it was on the league tables, and said, well, it's a nonsense university because it's, up at 100 or so. They said, when you finally got a degree, Callum, you'll know that this is all superstitious nonsense. And I said, well, I discovered that after my first 2 degrees, and then when I got 4 and my 2 doctorates, and one of them is in parapsychology and the other one dabbled with it, so I do know what I'm talking about. They left that alone. And then they said, well, where are these published? And they picked out the Journal of Parapsychology amongst them. They said, well, impact factor. Can you tell everyone, Callum, what impact factor is? And I said, well, it tells you when you publish in that journal what its recitation level will be, how well it will actually get out there. And they said, well, yeah, it's 0.5 for parapsychology. And well, if you want to get impact, psychology is the wrong profession. Some of the best journals have 4 as their impact level. To give you a comparison, the British Medical Journal's at 25. And then things like the Lancet and others, they start to go even above that. You want to be in the bigger science, physics and so forth, you get that impact from their bigger journals. Psychology doesn't get a lot of recitation. It's one of the more baby side branches. So parapsychology within that, you have to come out like this, start speaking and engaging with the public to say what's going on and what's happening. They tried every argument under the sun to try and knock me down. It was really nasty. If there was anyone else, I think people would have given up, got upset or name called. I remained polite, professional, and I kept going. And I got the last word every time. I felt great because I needed to get my frustration out that day. It was like I'd thrown every one of them into the ground like a dart. And I thought, you know what? I've given you everything you've asked for, and you're still just calling me a name. Dog, bitch, all sorts of things came up for me. I thought, well, there's no need to do that. And there was other people in that saying, why are you being so polite with them? And then there were other people were trying to defend me. These people then started following me on Twitter and stuff like that, those that were in favor of what I was saying, because I was so professional and calm and collective. And you said, give me the evidence, and I've given you the evidence. You say, where's the debate? There's the debate. Where's the information for that? There it is. What else would you like? I'm not giving you the end result and saying it is Psi. I'm just saying the potential evidence for it, been studied, here it is. So we need to study these interactions a lot more. Otherwise, it's just like me right now, it's my account of it. Let's look at these on the whole and what's going on, where the problem is with trying to communicate with people about this. And why, when they act like that, why are they so defensive or downright nasty and rude?
Thank you very much for answering that.
No problem.
Okie doke, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to ask one last question. Some of the most committed skeptics I know, says Peter, are parapsychologists. Is there a schism or schisms within the field?
I think it's important. I mean, I always say to people that if you're involved in any branch of science, you should be a skeptic. You should be questioning everything that you're doing, even through to being someone that's involved in cancer research. You should be questioning the alternatives. and what else is going on with those outcomes, the ifs, the buts, the maybes. You need to question those rather than instantly accept the outcome because of what you've read before. Look at all those alternatives that can come up. There's certainly divides in the parapsychological community in terms of, we've got some that are on one extreme scale that you could probably label better anomalist psychologists, because they're more interested in the psychological mechanisms behind what can make things appear as though it's a paranormal event, or anomalous event as I prefer to say, when actually it isn't. We're creating the illusion consciously or unconsciously for ourselves. And then actually beyond that, if we look at all the conventional explanations, including the psychological mechanisms, is there something new going on, such as actual ESP and mind reaching out or information coming to mind? And so you've got that extreme scale. If we move this across, and that's in the middle, you've also got some parapsychologists that are still interested in survival and the idea of mind surviving beyond bodily death as well. I'm certainly interested in that as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that I believe that people do survive after death in a disembodied state, or the mind does, but I'm interested in the claims, the evidence, how people have gone about researching it, because I am a skeptical activist. I'm very skeptical towards the evidence, but I go where the data and evidence is. And from what I've seen, Essel Cardenia's paper, studying it and working in the field for so long, the evidence is very strong, comparable to other psychology studies, if not better in many instances as well. It's very much in favour. So I'll go in that direction, not with any particular belief, but I'm following the data with a skeptical hat on. But those are the extreme scales that we've got. But I think everyone is working together for the greater good, because we're all very respectful of each other, the data, the history, what we know. Even Chris French, who classed himself as an anomalistic psychologist, very well known as a skeptic, Professor Chris French at Goldsmiths University. His last great talk on this, where he was talking about parapsychology is a science, and said, well, by its very methods, regardless of the phenomena, it is. He said, although he doesn't class himself as a parapsychologist, he considers himself among their number. So we do get quite a sliding scale, but everyone's working together for the greater good.
Well, it's good to know that you can agree to disagree ultimately without there being fisticuffs, because we need to be able to learn to hold different views with each other and be respectful.
So important. I mean, even when I mentioned Chuck Honiton and the Gansfeld, he was up against Ray Hyman, I think it was. I think he was the main critic against the Gansfeld. But they ultimately finished their main critique of the outcomes by doing a joint paper together. So they both presented in one paper their outcomes, even though they both had a different outcome, where one was in favour of Psi. The other one, Ray, accepted the statistical outcome, but said, I think it's due to something else, but I'm not sure what that is yet. That's how we need to work together.
Absolutely. Well, Cal, as always, it is such a pleasure to have you with us at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. Thank you so much. So yes, for those of you, please do have a look and see what is going on. So please check out the book.
Check out Psi Wars, Kindle, paperback, go and have a look at all these controversies. Check out my my forward in there, where again, it's very much a personal take and talking about some of the things that I mentioned here today, but go and explore, enjoy the literature, and if you want to know anything else, go to my website, calamecooper.com, and send me an email, follow me on Twitter, anything. It's been a pleasure seeing you all, those that I can see, and to everyone else that I can't see, thank you so much for coming to listen to me to something I just threw together.
You'd never believe that, would you? So thank you so much. And we're keeping it in-house next week, because next Tuesday we have Professor Chris Rowe, also from the University of Northampton, and he is going to be talking about recent developments in parapsychology. So there's no excuse for those of us who are logging onto the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre not to be conversant with the latest thinking in parapsychology. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along this evening, to Dr. Cal Cooper, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.